So now I'm pleased to introduce our next panelist, David Banisar. David is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics and a senior international fellow at the Government Accountability Project in Washington. David was previously the head of Transparency for Article 19, a research fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a visiting fellow at the University of Leeds School of Law. David will be speaking on the topic of information technology and transparency, the user push for data. Welcome, David. We are excited to hear your perspective on the role of information technology in promoting transparency. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Donato. And good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for the invite to speak here today. As we discuss today, the tools like artificial intelligence and how they can be used to fight corruption, I'd like to speak about access to the underlying data, at least the public data, and how we got here. Because I think it's important to understand where we are now, but how we started and the challenges that were faced in getting to the point we are and the limitations we still face that have already been discussed a little bit to give us a better idea of where to go from here. So I want to cover two main points in this. One is around a sort of background to how we got to where we are today and what lessons we can take from the fights and the challenges that were and the successes and failures. And the other is the challenges that we face with the data that's available. And then finally, if I have enough time, I'll talk a little bit about one of the most currently successful campaigns for increasing public access information around beneficial ownership registers. So this is a very potted history, but I mean, we're basically sort of 30 years now into the public computer data era. But it's important to remember that, you know, it wasn't invented 30 years ago. We had access to census data, we had access to official statistics, the humble phone book, birth, marriage, death registers. So we're in an era of big data now, but you know, access to data has existed for centuries in some form. It was just took a lot more effort to be able to process it. But the sort of current era started, let's just say the early 90s, around the development of the commercial internet. And then you had activists in the US mostly trying to access databases that were being held by the government, still on large but getting smaller computers. So there was something called the Edgar database, which still exists, run by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So to know all about public companies and the data that they have to release to the federal government of the US, that information was, you could commercially buy it, but it wasn't publicly available in any kind of easy way. So some activists bought access to it, stuck it up on an internet website for a couple of years. And finally, the Securities and Exchange Commissions decided to make it public themselves. So that was really sort of the first public database out there. There were other ones before that, but that was one where the public said, we want this information, made it available, and then investors use it and everybody else was able to use it. I mean, in that era also, you had the Clinton-Gore administration pushing access to the internet, and Clinton signed something called the Electronic Freedom of Information Act, which made it possible to demand databases from the US government. And the US government actually had to give it to them. Before then, some courts allowed it, others said it wasn't a record. So there was a real fight then. By the 2000s, you had the sort of the open data movement starting to emerge around the development of shared principles around access, structure, reuse, and making data freely available. There was legal developments like the European Union adopting the Public Sector Information Directive, the PSI directive. And at the same time, you had a parallel development where lots and lots of countries were adopting freedom of information laws. Starting in 1990, there was only about 12 countries. By the time you hit, well, now let's say it's 130 countries. So there's been a mass development in just 30 years of countries adopting FOI laws. And those laws give people a right to access information. And they are quite mixed still on access to data. They've been growing better on that, but quite mixed on that. Open data at the same time is being pushed by governments, by the civic tech activists. And open data was seen by governments as being an alternative to freedom of information. So rather than a rights-based approach, it was a voluntary approach. One US minister, I can't remember whether it was Francis Maud or our long lamented former health minister, who said that he wanted to replace FOIA with open data. But I mean, without that sort of legal underpinning, you have the problem of the reliability of the government is releasing information it wants to release rather than what is asked for by the public. But I would say now you see a lot more right to information laws that are more open data oriented. So they give that rights approach. The Netherlands just rewrote their law last year and sort of made it a half open data, half FOI law. They include reuse in them because the EU directive requires that, but lots of other countries have done that also. And then you have this real well-established civil society movement around open government, but also around open contracting, open procurement issues, open ownership, which I'll talk about, open budgets. So there is a real movement of different groups. At the same time, you have multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Open Government Partnership and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and smaller ones around fisheries and medicine and construction. So there's a lot of, I don't know, you could call it infrastructure almost. There's a lot of movement, let's say. And there's partners in reformers and governments, especially in the multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then, of course, what was just mentioned around ESGs and due diligence, which is a really exciting area around corporate transparency. And, you know, possibly in a couple of years, we're going to see a lot of new data available that will be able to link in with that information. So that's where we are, but what are the challenges we face? So, I mean, there is still a real issue on access. So if you were following at all around COVID and procurement, there was some major problems, not just in the UK and the US, but other places where contracts around procurement were just hidden and people had to use legal means to try and get access to it. The UK government has a system they called Contract Finder, which even people inside the government call Contract Hider because it's so dire. It's supposed to have all the contracts in the UK of any importance, and it doesn't. Let's say asset disclosure databases where officials, especially politically exposed officials, have to make information available about their assets and to make sure that they're not stealing money or getting bribes or whatever. And only about a third of the countries in the world have a public register on that. And even those registers really vary in what they have in them. So there's a lot of problems on that. There's immense problems around accuracy and reliability of public data. There's a real interesting article written quite recently by Martinez and Whitley. Whitley is one of my colleagues at the LSE, and they look at Brazilian procurement. And they just took one small Brazilian procurement body, and they discovered that most of the contracts are, even with a sophisticated system of online contracting that they're doing there was still a parallel process being done inside the body that then the outputs of that parallel process could be manipulated because it was all done on paper mostly, or done electronically but outside of the system. And then the inputs are put in to make it look like the contracts were good, but quite a few of them were not done the way the contracts were supposed to be done. So that means the public access to the data is then biased by the fact that The information in there is not terribly reliable. UK Companies House here. I mean, if you look at some of the things about that, there was a company that had the director was Adolf Tooth Fairy Hitler, and Judas Iscariot was another co-director, and they had assets of 666 pounds. That's because the Companies House doesn't have the authority to verify the data. They just receive it and then they make it public. So relying on it is very, very dubious. There was one place that had 250,000 companies in North London, one house that had 250,000 companies registered at it. And an 88-year-old who worked for that company was registered for 30,000 of those companies as a director, at least initially. So serious problems with verification. And then on the other side, one of my colleagues who does open ownership mentioned to me a real problem around the technology being used to create companies super fast and then disappearing. Because in the UK, all companies are supposed to be registered within 24 hours and cost, I think, £12 still, which is far more than the 1,700 employees of Companies House can track, do any kind of verification. Anybody else can do any verification. Then there's also an issue around intellectual property. There was a real problem with, say, Dunn's owning the corporate number, but how do you, without a common corporate number across the world, how do you track companies and be able to identify who person is, the company, is it the same company in this country as this country, and so on. And that's still being worked through on that. So to give you an idea on access issues, the Global Data Barometer for 2021, the rankings, only 25% of the countries have adequate land information available, 26% have company information available, 47% of procurement, which is better, 49% financial information, so spending and that sort of thing, and 25% political integrity, so politically exposed persons, public assets, and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. There was a new transparency index that was just released a week or two ago by a German institute that found there was really a 30% gap between law and reality on what the law requires to be made available and what the data is actually available to have transparency for those particular countries. Another problem already mentioned around data knowledge and the digital divide. I mean, AI is great, but it's really, in the end, a lot of sophisticated instructions being programmed into a computer. Somebody has to do that. Somebody has to understand the systems and the data and know what to ask. You can't just throw a bunch of data at an AI system and it will suddenly know what it's talking about. So you need intermediaries like CSOs, journalists, and so on. I mean, of course, half the world doesn't have access to the internet still. So there's that. And then one final problem that's coming up reasonably frequently these days is the issue of data protection. Obviously, as was said at the very beginning, there are serious ethical issues that need to be addressed when collecting all this data. About 130 countries have data protection laws now too. So the question is how you balance the access, what kinds of information should be public versus what should remain private. And that is a balance that frankly is still being worked out. So let me, if I've got 1 minute, let me just say about beneficial ownership. I know I'm a little over, but beneficial ownership is one of those areas where things have really progressed amazingly. I mean, you probably have heard all about the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and all that about the shell companies being used to hide taxes and do money laundering and all that. Since 2016, when actually the UK government was a leader to make the beneficial ownership register public, which also, by the way, even the police say is a little dubious for use because of the reliability. It's now up to about 130 countries have said they want to, are committed to doing at least ownership central registers, not necessarily public yet, but I mean, that's an evolutionary process. The EU is a good leader on this with the anti-money laundering directives, which first made them registers and then made them public. There's been a setback because of data protection concerns on that. The extractive industries have required it for mining. OGP has done it. So from all of this, let me just say that to get to this public access information, to be useful for researchers, for investigators, for AI, for whoever, you really do need a lot of work at the back end. You need a lot of stakeholders pushing for access. You need a lot of viewpoints, expert and others who say, this is what I want, this is what's available, this is what we can do with it, and so on. You need a public engagement. The Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers is really what made beneficial ownership. That kind of data would not have been made public if it weren't shown to the public through this leak how important it was out there. And finally, there's of course political will, but political will doesn't magically appear on its own. It needs public pressure usually. So it's these other stakeholders that then create the public will for governments to then go forward and make this data available and improve it over time. Thank you.
For your valuable input on the growing importance of transparency. In particular, I loved your concept of open government, open ownership. So I think that this will be the concept of the future. So we will need to work on that. And thanks for having done it from the perspective of data.